Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 here of English 112 at Delta College. This week, we're starting the next assignment sequence, which is the rhetorical analysis. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So we need to identify or define, rather, a couple terms here. First of all, what is rhetoric? Rhetoric can be defined in a few different ways. Um, the sort of traditional definition, as we have here, is the means by which symbols are used to articulate a message or the use of language to persuade. And that's really the second part of that definition that we're focusing on, which is the way that we use language to persuade. Uh, if you ever hear during an election season people talking about partisan rhetoric, and there's always so much rhetoric out there. But what does that mean? Well, rhetoric again is the means by which language is used to persuade or to articulate a message. So partisan rhetoric is language is used to articulate a certain political party's perspective. Once again, the overriding theme or idea or concept of this class is that writing is about power. We write to get what we want. And as I explained with the first assignment, the first step in gaining that power in writing is knowing who your audience is. The second step is using the language and ideas and strategies that are going to be most effective to persuading your audience. And that's rhetoric. That's where the rhetoric comes in. Analysis, then, because this assignment is a rhetorical analysis. Analysis is when you break something down into its pieces or its components in order to see how it works. So, analysis means to identify the components of something. And in this case, a rhetorical analysis is when you take someone's argument and you break it down into its components, its language, its ideas in order to see how they function. And for, I think, a really good example of that, I want you to pause this video and go take a look at Nerdwriter's video on how Donald Trump answers a question. Okay, that video does a really good analysis of the way that Donald Trump uses language. So, for example, what are some of the techniques that he uses? Well, he tends to speak in the second person. He uses you quite a lot. And when he refers to himself, it's often in the third person, as if it's another person speaking about him. And I think the reason why he does that is it implicates the audience into his perspective or into whatever it is that he's trying to communicate. He's part of the audience. He is one of you. He tends to be monosyllabic, meaning he tends to use words that consist of one syllable, two syllables at most. And as they point out in the video, it's very rare for him to use more than two syllable words. And I think the reason why he does that is it sort of appeals to the lowest common denominator, education wise. People who tend to be more educated tend to have larger vocabularies. And so by using those monosyllabic words, he's able to communicate or say things in a way that anyone can understand. He tends to speak in fragments and simple sentences. If you recall, when we look at the basic elements of grammar, a complete sentence or an independent clause consists of a subject, a verb, and an object. So when you have a sentence that has those three parts, that's what we call a simple sentence. And so when he speaks, he tends to use simple sentences at most. He also tends to speak much more frequently in fragments or dependent clauses. So he tends to use incomplete sentences quite a lot. And when he does use complete sentences, they're simple. They consist of a single subject, verb, and object. And again, I think the idea for that is it's very simple language that anyone can understand. He tends to be emotional and use emotionally loaded phrases. And we'll get into that a little bit later today. That idea of pathos, that is using emotional manipulation. He tends to end clauses with strong nouns because doing so uh, ends on a word that is really punchy, as they say in the video. It's very memorable. And he uses quite a lot of repetition. And again, the reason for that is it makes what he says more memorable, not just for him as a speaker, but also for the audience as well. So he uses all of these techniques in order to speak to an audience that is very common and uh, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, Not necessarily uneducated, but unsophisticated, perhaps. It's common language that anyone can understand. And so he's appealing to a very common kind of audience. And that brings us into the ideas or the concepts of classical rhetoric. And I've posted a handout on the e-learning in which I break these down and discuss these a little bit more in terms of rhetorical strategies and appeals. So there are three classical appeals, which are logos, pathos, and ethos. Classical meaning they go back to the ancient Greeks. So logos is the appeal to logic. It is when you make an argument that's based on logical reasoning or quite a lot of research. And so it's typically supported by three strategies. And the strategies that we're going to discuss, they can be used to support any of these appeals, but they're typically used to support certain appeals. So, for example, the use of authority and analogy tend to be used to support logos more than the other appeals. So, assertion is a forceful statement. It's a statement of opinion that's presented in such a way that it sounds like it's a common sense truth. It is a claim of truth, in other words. Even though it may or may not be factually true, it's presented as if the logic of it is readily apparent. So an assertion is a forceful statement, and it can be used to support logos if the statement is rooted in logical reasoning. Authority is when you use specific expertise or information from an outside source. Authority is it's when you appeal to, or rather, you have someone, you take someone's expertise and let it speak for them. Now, it's possible for you to be recognized as an expert in a certain field, in which case that will give you ethos, as we'll talk about. But if you don't have recognized expertise in a certain field, you can import that by using the words and ideas of people who are recognized experts. So we would call these authorities. An authority is someone who has some specialized knowledge or expertise in a certain area. So, for example, let's say the Surgeon General of the United States tells you that smoking is hazardous to your health. That's probably going to be an effective assertion coming from that particular source, because that source, the Surgeon General, is someone who is recognized as having expertise in the field of healthcare. Now, if someone else who isn't perceived as being a credible source in the field of healthcare were to tell you that smoking is hazardous to your health, it may be true, and in fact, we know that it's true, but it's going to be less convincing because that person doesn't have recognized expertise. So authority is when you support your argument with expert testimonies, with facts, statistics, with research. Analogy gets a little confusing because analogies are comparisons between two things, saying that they function or that they behave in the same way. So they're rooted in logical relationships. And people get a little in trouble when dealing with analogies because it can be difficult to tell the difference between an analogy, a simile, and a metaphor, even though they're all forms of figurative language. A simile compares two things, saying that they have some sort of shared characteristic. They're similar in some way. A metaphor says that two things are the same thing, even though they appear to be different. And an analogy says these two things function or behave in the same way. So analogies are forms of explaining difficult concepts in easier to understand ways by comparing an abstraction, for example, to something that is more concrete and easily understood. And often, if you've ever taken a standardized test, you get tested on analogies and logical relationships between things. So this is to this as that is to that. For example, sun is to day as blank is to night. And you're supposed to fill in the blank, which you should fill in with moon, because the moon functions at night in a very same way or similar way as the sun during the day. It sheds light or provides light during that time of day. So that's the way that analogies work. Analogies are forms of explanations. They're used to explain difficult concepts by comparing them to something that's more easily understood and saying, if it's true of this, it must be true of that as well. And again, they're based on logical relationships. Now, analogies only work as long as the two things being compared actually relate to each other. There is a logical fallacy called the false analogy. And we'll talk about fallacies next week. But a false analogy is when you compare two things that just aren't alike, that they don't relate to each other. And so these strategies, which are used to support these appeals, they have their strengths and their weaknesses. So analogies can be a very strong form of explaining difficult ideas. But again, the weakness is if you compare two things that don't relate to each other, then that falls apart. Authority, yeah, it's a very a powerful way of convincing people to see things by using expert testimony and facts and statistics. But if the source you're using is not perceived as credible, then that's going to backfire. And the same with assertion. Assertions can be very powerful ways of persuading people to see things from a certain perspective. But an assertion is ultimately a statement of opinion. And we know when we argue that there has to be a difference of opinion. So for every opinion, there is a counter opinion. Okay, so that's logos. Pathos is the appeal to emotion. It's the use of emotional manipulation. And these can be very powerful because we base many of our decisions based on, or we make a lot of our decisions based on the way that we feel about things, which is something that advertisers know how to use really well. They want us to feel a certain way about their product. And so if we feel good about that product, we're going to be more inclined to buy that product. And next week, we'll look more specifically at advertising and the way that they use that emotional manipulation. But pathos, again, is the appeal to emotion to make you feel a certain way and let those feelings sway your thoughts and your opinions. So pathos is supported by assertion as well, because if you make a bold statement that provokes a strong emotional response, that's something that resonates with people and makes your argument more memorable. Pathos is also supported by anecdote and allusion. Anecdotes are stories which illustrate your point. They're typically rooted in personal experience, or they're true stories in some sense, although they don't have to be. You can create a hypothetical situation to illustrate your point, and that counts as anecdote as well. And then allusion. This gets a little confusing as well, because people misinterpret the term. Allusion is a reference to something that is easily recognizable or that you expect your audience to understand. Like I said, these strategies have strengths and weaknesses. The strength of an anecdote is it's a story which illustrates your point, which sort of humanizes the point that you're trying to make by putting a human face on it, which makes it easier to relate to. At the same time, though, if your only supporting evidence is in the form of anecdotes and you don't have authority, for example, and facts and statistics to support your argument, then that's going to be a weak argument. So, yes, you can have really strong anecdotes, but you can't rely solely on anecdotes to make a strong argument. And then an illusion is good because it helps people to connect with things by referencing something that they're familiar with, something that they automatically understand, and they can take their understanding of that reference and apply it to the current situation. So, for example, if I said that your grade in this class is like the Titanic, then you know what that means because you should know what happened to the Titanic. But illusions only work as long as you get the reference. So if you don't understand the reference, then that's not going to make any sense to you. So, for example, if I were to say, I was walking down the hallway and I saw someone who made my spidey sense tingle, and you don't know spidey sense, you don't know that that comes from Spider-Man, and that is his extrasensory perception that alerts him to danger, that's not going to make any sense to you. So illusions only work as long as you get the reference. So that's why it's important to know who your audience is, or one of the reasons why it's important to know who your audience is, because if you can use illusions that your audience understands, then that can be really helpful. And then finally, ethos. Whereas logos is the logical argument, pathos is the pathetic argument, pathetic meaning provoking emotion. Ethos is the ethical argument, but it's not ethical in the sense of being ethically right or wrong. It is the appeal to character or credibility. So if someone is perceived as being credible and consistent in their arguments and their beliefs, then that gives them ethos. So if you have credibility or expertise in a certain area, then you can make claims in that area that are going to be more persuasive based on your expertise or your credibility. But if you don't have that credibility, or if you're not recognized as having expertise in that area, then you can import that through the use of authority. So ethos is supported by assertion, again, anecdote, and authority. So assertions, as long as you're perceived as being credible, then the assertions you make should be perceived as being credible as well and persuasive based on that. Anecdotes can be used to establish authority or ethos, rather. If you tell a story which helps to establish your experience with that issue or that topic, then that helps to establish your credibility. And then finally, authority. Like I said, if you don't have credibility or if you're not recognized as having expertise in that area, then you can import that through the use of research and show that you're not just making something up, but you have facts and data to support your argument. So I want you to pause here and go read Maureen Dowd's editorial, Appeasing the Trigger Gods. And as you read through it, I want you to try to identify which rhetorical appeals are used in the article, logos, pathos, or ethos, and then identify which strategies are used to support them: assertion, anecdote, analogy, allusion, authority. So go read that article and try to analyze it and identify the appeals and strategies. Okay, so let's go through and break this down. So hopefully you notice that all of the strategies and appeals are being used in that editorial, in that argument. So for logos, the use of logical reasoning, Dowd relies upon the use of authority. So she cites sources and quotes sources. So in this case, she cites Donald Trump's book, The America We Deserve, by showing what he actually wrote or was written on his behalf, that he favored a slightly longer waiting period to purchase a gun. And then she again quotes Donald Trump by saying, "You came through big for me, and I'm going to come through for you," he told the NRA after his election, out Hestoning Charlton Heston. So she looks at, or she provides evidence and proof that Donald Trump has changed his perspective or views on gun control, going from in favor of some form of gun control, such as a longer waiting period, to uh, going in the opposite direction and being all support, going all in terms of supporting the NRA, or the National Rifle Association. So she uses that authority to back up her claim that Donald Trump has changed his tune, if you will. She also uses some analogies in there. Again, some comparisons between things to show that one thing is like the other. America would accept periodic human sacrifices to the trigger gods. So here she's saying that school shootings and instances of gun violence are being accepted by American society as if they are religious sacrifices. They're sort of taken for granted as some sort of necessity for our religious or social beliefs as a society. We can't even summon the energy to break the chokehold that the NRA has on Republicans in Congress. In this case, comparing the support, or the what's the word I'm looking for? The influence that the National Rifle Association has on Republicans, by comparing it to a chokehold. It happened with the Catholic Church. It happened with Hollywood. In this case, she talks about the instances of gun violence in this country as being similar to what happened with the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandal, and the sexual abuse scandal that happened with the entertainment industry during the Me Too movement. So she's saying that this is like that. So she's drawing logical comparisons. Now, it's debatable whether these comparisons actually make sense and that they function in the same way. That's sort of beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now. Right now, we're just identifying what she is doing, and that is what she is doing. She's making those analogies. And then pathos. She makes an emotional appeal in her arguments through the use of assertion. Then I gave up. If the sight of slaughtered angels did not dent the nation's conscience, could anything? We knew that other countries could stem mass killings, homicides, and suicides with gun control and gun buybacks, but we didn't care. So, in this example, she's using some very loaded language that is meant to provoke a strong emotional response. Slaughtered angels, for example, referencing the massacre at Sandy Hook. Slaughtered is a word that we have strong negative connotations with. And as we talked about before, words have both denotations and connotations. Denotations are the actual definitions of words, whereas connotations are all of the feelings and ideas that we associate with the word. So in the case of slaughter, we have negative connotations with that word. But we didn't care, she says. And that has, again, a strong negative connotation to it. Mass killings, homicides, suicides, again, really strong, loaded language. When societies try to protect a malevolent status quo, they become warped. The most chilling sign of this is when people look the other way as the most vulnerable members of society are preyed on. Again, loaded language with very negative connotations. So it's really calculated to provoke a strong emotional response. And then she uses anecdote stories to illustrate her point in order to create that sense of emotional response or emotional impact. The Orlando shooting also provided confirmation that the emotionally stunted Trump would not be a parental healer for the country when he tweeted congratulations to himself for predicting the shooter would have links to terrorism rather than offering comforting words to the grieving families and friends and to shaken Americans. So here she's using an example of something that Donald Trump did in order to provoke a sense of outrage against him. In an interview at NRA headquarters, which proudly displayed a model of the pistol used to assassinate Lincoln, LaPierre explained that AK semi automatics were just uglier hunting guns and that he knew how to hunker down during periods of hysteria after shootings. So, again, another example of what the head of the NRA said that is used to provoke a negative emotional response toward the NRA. And then she uses allusions in order to convey that sense of pathos. And there are quite a few allusions that she makes in here. Art of the Deal is a reference to a book that Donald Trump wrote or that has his name attached to it. References Charlton Heston, who was the actor who perhaps best known for playing Moses in the Ten Commandments, who was also a longtime head of the NRA. References Abraham Lincoln, who's widely regarded as one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history, who was assassinated by a gun, or by someone with a gun. She references Joe Biden, our previous vice president, and it's expected that her audience will know whom she's referring to. She references LBJ, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, the previous U.S. president, who became president after the assassination, of John F. Kennedy, again, who was killed with a gun. References John Wayne, the Second Amendment, Newtown, Harvey Weinstein, and the hashtag #MeToo movement. And notice that she doesn't explain what any of these things are. She expects you to already know what these things are and that you can supply your knowledge of that to what she is currently talking about. And then finally, ethos. She works to establish her credibility through the use of anecdote and authority. So in this case, she says, I started covering gun control back in 1989 when the first Bush administration banned imports of most semi-automatic rifles. And skepticism was growing about the NRA's mantra that anyone should be able to buy anything with a trigger. So she uses that anecdote to establish her credibility or her expertise as a journalist who has covered gun control for quite a long time. And then she uses the authority, uses the outside sources and the research and the quotations in order to show that she is not making this up. She has actual evidence and data to back up her claims. And in this case, she cites Donald Trump, Wayne LaPierre, and the New York Post. Okay. So she uses all of those strategies and appeals in order to construct an argument that is meant to persuade people to be more in favor of gun control. Now, does she succeed? That is a question that everyone has to decide for themselves because there's no right or wrong answer there. So you can argue that her use of rhetoric is really sophisticated and is effective because of that. I mean, clearly she knows rhetoric and how to use rhetoric, and I think there's no denying that. You can also argue that it's not an effective use of rhetoric because perhaps she relies too much on emotional manipulation or pathos as opposed to logic or facts and statistics. She does have authority in there, but she doesn't have a whole lot of statistics to back up her claims. That's a fair criticism, I think. And then you can argue that it's not going to be an effective argument because everyone has already made up their minds about the issue of gun control. Either they're in favor of it or they're not. And so that's not an effective argument, you could argue, because she's kind of preaching to the choir. I mean, really, her audience is probably people who are already going to be inclined to agree with her. And that's a fair point. But that's the idea that of what you have to do for this assignment is you have to take someone's argument and break it down that way, identify the strategies and appeals being used, and then evaluate how effective the argument is. So, analyze an argumentative text. So, argumentative meaning that has to have more than one side to it. So, it could be an editorial like this one, it could be an advertisement or a speech, whatever it is, as long as someone is trying to be persuasive in it. And I encourage you to choose an argument in your area of interest so that you can gain more expertise in that area of interest for yourself. And then break it down, identify the appeals and strategies used in the text, and evaluate their effectiveness. The first draft is going to be due at the end of week 6, and the final draft will be due at the end of week 8. And I have posted an assignment sheet on e-learning that breaks down step by step how to go about writing this. Excuse me. Okay, now one thing you have to be careful about is finding a text that is argumentative. So you have to be able to tell the difference between an editorial and a report. And this can be tricky. Now, when I was a kid, in public school, probably around 3rd or 4th grade, we were taught how to tell the difference between an opinion and a fact by looking at newspaper articles. And that doesn't really happen so much anymore in education because newspapers are seen as really outdated and outmoded. And so everything has shifted to online. So people tend to get their news from online sources. And that gets really problematic because it becomes difficult to tell the difference between what is meant to be news and what is meant to be an argument. Because anyone can post whatever they want to online. There's no editorial oversight, or rather, there's very little editorial oversight. And so we run into the problem of fake news, where people will just make stuff up. And as I've said before, when we read, we tend to take things at face value. And so we don't necessarily think our way through what we read and read critically and identify if something is legitimate or not. So, and that's something that you have to be able to do. You have to be able to read critically and identify the different types of text that you receive online. So in this case, let's take a look at a couple articles from the New York Times related to video games. One is an editorial and one is a report. How do you tell the difference? Let's take a look here. Okay, so in this article, hold on here, let me make sure that you're seeing it. There we go. Okay, so this article, Esports Sees Profit in Attracting Female Gamers by Gregory Schmidt, December 21st of 2016. It begins, Mark Religioso, a brand manager for the video game publisher Bandai Namco Entertainment, wants more women to be involved in the professional gaming arena known as esports, where players compete in video game tournaments to win thousands of dollars in prize money. So this year, Mr. Religioso began planning Body and Clyde tournaments, where esports teams consist of one man and one woman. He also began laying the groundwork for a mentoring program to foster interest in esports among women. These are baby steps so that we can get more women on the team, he said. We need to make the scene a welcoming place. Mr. Religioso's efforts are one of several recent moves by video game makers and publishers to increase diversity in esports, which is rapidly becoming one of the video game industry's most visible segments. As more women play video games, the esports industry is starting to focus on getting more of them involved in professional competition to help the effort expand and become mainstream. Now, I'm not going to go through and read the rest of the article. You can do that on your own. But I want to point out how to tell what kind of article this is. Is it an editorial or is it a report? And really, in order to tell the difference, you have to ask yourself, what is the goal of the article or the text? What is it trying to accomplish? Is it trying to persuade or is it trying to inform? In this case, this is a news report. It's trying to inform. Even though it does have some perhaps opinionated statements being made, those statements are being made in the form of quotations. So in this case, the author is not interjecting his own opinion into the piece. He's just presenting the information and letting you, as the audience, make up your own mind. So it's much more fact-based than an editorial, which is going to be much more opinion-based. And this seems pretty obvious or easy to tell here that this is meant to be a news report. But it's not always going to be that easy, because much of what passes for news nowadays, especially online, is really opinionated. So even though something is meant to be informative, people who aren't necessarily trained journalists will interject their own opinions into what they're saying, and it blurs the lines between what is meant to be a report and what is meant to be an editorial. Excuse me. Let's look at this one. Now, this comes from the opinion section. So that's a big clue right there. Excuse me. Super Mario Run's Not So Super Gender Politics by Chris Sewellentrop. Now, as I've said before, titles are really important because they should tell you what the subject matter is and what the thesis is. And in this case, the title has that statement of opinion right there in it. Super Mario Run's Not So Super Gender Politics. So it's making a claim of value. That's another clue that you're dealing with an editorial. Last week, after a wait of almost a decade, the world's most popular video game series, Super Mario Brothers, finally came to the world's most popular video game machine, the iPhone. Nintendo's Super Mario Run went immediately to the top of the App Store charts, above mainstays like Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube. According to one estimate, the game was downloaded 37 million times in its first 3 days. Now, that first paragraph contains all factual information. There is nothing opinionated in it, and so that could make it confusing. Is this meant to be a report? Well, the next paragraph, unfortunately, despite Nintendo's history and reputation, Super Mario Run is not a family-friendly game, or at least not one my wife and I will be letting our 6-year-old daughter play. The game is rife with stale, retrograde gender stereotypes, elements that were perhaps expected in 1985, when the first Super Mario Brothers was released in the United States, but that today are just embarrassing. So now we have strong opinionated statements coming through. And that tells you that this is meant to be persuasive as opposed to informative. So yeah, it can be tricky to tell the difference. So you kind of have to train yourself a little bit to see the difference. You have to think critically and read critically. And again, the question that you have to answer when determining if something is meant to be an editorial or an argument is, what is it trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of the text? To inform or to persuade? And for this assignment, if you need help figuring that out, feel free to send me the link to an article or the argument or the advertisement that you are wanting to analyze, and I can help you figure out what the purpose of it is. Okay, and that's the homework assignment for this week, is to practice telling the difference between something that is meant to be informative and persuasive. So I want you to find an article online, email me the link with a paragraph that explains if it's an editorial or a report. So which is it, and how can you tell? And that's going to be due at the end of this week. Now, it may be an article that you end up using as uh, your argument that you want to analyze for this, although you don't have to do that. Right now, you just need to find an article and determine its purpose. Okay, so that's the homework for this week. And that is going to be the next assignment, which is the rhetorical analysis. So take it easy, take care, and I will talk to you again next week when we will look at logic and fallacies. So that's always fun. Okay, I will see you then.